Today we're going to be replacing the upper control arm on a 2005 Acura TL. Upper control arm is this right here, and there's the new one with a grease fitting and a new castle nut. So why are we replacing this? There's excessive play in the ball joint, and this vehicle has 230,000 plus kilometers on it. So rather than just replace the ball joint, we're going to swap out the entire control arm. And if you listen closely, I'm going to wiggle the tire, and you're going to listen for a clicking. So with the vehicle lifted up, supported with jack stands, how you check the ball joint is you hold the 12 o'clock and the 6 o'clock position on the tire and you wiggle it back and forth and see if there's any play. And if there is and there's clicking, then you're going to want to get the ball joint at the very least inspected to determine if it needs to be replaced. But watch the ball joint right here. You can see that it's got some play back and forth there, up and down, and it shouldn't be doing that, and it shouldn't be clicking. And when you're working on vehicles, safety first, of course. So I have both sides supported with jack stands. There's wheel chocks at the back of each of the rear tires, and the parking brake is set.
Remove the tire and then remove the brake caliper. If you don't know how to do that, check out my video on maintaining and cleaning your brakes.
So this is the upper control arm here. It's connected by 2 bolts on either side of the strut. Here's the ball joint, and the new control arm comes with the ball joint pressed in. What I'm going to do is I'm going to remove any cables like ABS hose, brake line. I think I might be good to leave alone. And I'm probably going to remove the axle nut because I'm guessing I'm going to need to pry down on this, and I just don't want to pull the CV axle joint more than I need to, because if I pull it down, there's a risk that the CV joint axle will actually come out. So I'm going to remove the wheel nut, leave that off while I'm working on the upper control arm, and then we'll go from there. When working on any older vehicles with dirt and rust and corrosion, I'm going to use penetrant spray on all of the bolts that I can before I get started.
Just as a note, penetrant spray also works great on plastic clips. So you're trying to remove plastic clips in and around areas that get really dirty. It's a great idea to clean them out as well as use penetrant spray. And it really helps them to come apart easily without snapping the plastic. Here we're removing the axle nut. Removing the ABS sensor line consists of one nut, where it's connected up here at the control arm, and then 2 other bolts further down the steering knuckle. So that's number 1. This is the second bolt here. And here's the third one. Here I'm removing the Cotter pin from the ball joint castle nut with a pair of pliers, and then I'm going to use vice grips, basically just to clamp onto that Cotter pin and pull it out. I'm not going to bother preserving the Cotter pin because I'm going to replace it with a new one. Now time to remove the castle nut, holding the ball joint in place. Oops, and here I'm going to loosely thread the castle nut back onto the ball joint stud so it protects it while I am hammering the steering knuckle. Here I am hammering the steering knuckle to shock the stud on the ball joint to get it to release. And pop, there it goes. And now I'm going to fully remove the castle nut.
I'm going to be removing, or at least dropping down that strut, so I can get access to the 2 14mm bolts holding in the upper control arm. I had to remove the strut bars. Basically, you've got 3 12mm nuts on one side, you've got about 3 10mm, and then a couple of plastic clips. Remove the strut bar. Once the strut bar is gone, then you gain access to these 3 strut bolts. So I'm going to loosen those up so I can drop the strut down, and from there we'll remove the control arm.
Just before we do that, we're going to remove the bolt that's holding in the damper fork to the lower control arm. The damper fork is also connected to the strut, and it uses a bolt to sort of pinch it together on the strut. We'll be removing that as well. My experience with removing bolts, especially suspension bolts, ones that have been subject to dirt and weather for a long time, is that sometimes they really get stuck inside and it's a bit of a chore and an effort to get them out. So I usually use penetrant spray, a multitude of different tools, and some patience, and eventually it'll come out. It also helps to push the bolt from the other side while you're trying to loosen it from this side. Here I'm breaking free the upper pinch bolt that I mentioned earlier on the damper fork. There's basically a nut on one side that you remove first, and then you remove the bolt on the other side. And then, with everything loosened, I basically pull the strut out, free up that space that I need to access the control arm bolts. Here we're going to loosen and remove the two 14mm bolts holding the upper control arm in place. You'll notice that I switch back and forth between hand tools and power tools. Hand tools give me more control, and they're less prone to stripping and breaking off old bolts or rusted bolts, whereas the power tools are definitely a boost for efficiency. Comparing the old ball joint to the new one, you can see the old is wobbly and the new one is stiff. Here I am installing the Zerk fitting, or the grease fitting, onto the new upper control arm ball joint. Basically just screw it in, start it off, then I use a wrench to tighten it up, and I want the Zerk fitting to face outwards, so it'll be easier to add grease in the future. So then I use my grease gun with basic bearing or chassis grease, and I just fill up the ball joint boot with grease. All done. Give it a bit of a wipe and we're good to go. Installing the new upper control arm is basically just a reverse of removal. So I'm going to install it. I'm going to start off the bolts by hand, and once it's all in place, we will tighten them up with a torque wrench after. If you don't have a set of ratcheting wrenches, I think they are one of the best tools to have available. They're really good for installing or removing bolts in tight spaces where you can't fit an impact wrench or a ratchet, and they're much faster than the regular combination wrenches that do not have the ratcheting. And it looks like I have superhuman speed here, but I've just sped up the video so you don't have to watch it for as long. So here I'm using a torque wrench just to tighten them up to the final torque spec. Reinstalling the strut is also the opposite of removal, and it really only goes in one way. So you're going to put it up there, hold it in place while you secure one of the nuts up top. That way you don't have to hold it the entire time. Then after you've got that done, you're going to go back underneath, you're going to set up the damper fork, get it in place, get the bolts ready to go. And so back up top, I'm going to finish securing the strut in place with the other two nuts. And with the ratchet here, I'm just going to initially tighten them up And so back underneath, what I'm doing here is I'm pushing the strut upwards to try to get it as flush as I can while I'm reaching upwards with the ratchet to tighten them down a little bit further. And here's the final tightening down with a torque wrench. Back underneath again, I'm going to push that damper fork right up to that collar. Once it's there, I'm going to throw that bolt back into that spot where it's basically pinching the damper fork to the bottom of the strut. Meanwhile, I'm going to put the bolt down at the bottom of the suspension that connects it to the lower control arm. And from here, I'm just hand tightening it all. Final tightening with a torque wrench. Reattaching the ball joint stud to the top of the steering knuckle. It's useful to have another set of hands here. And here I'm just tightening it up initially by hand. The new nut for the ball joint is not a castle nut, so it doesn't come with a cotter pin, it just self-locks. Every time you remove the axle nut, it is recommended to get a new one. So that's what I've done here. I install a new axle nut, and initially I used an impact to get it on, and then I'm tightening it by hand a little bit further, and then here I'm torquing it down. The torque spec for the axle nut is 181 foot-pounds. And after you've tightened it down, you need to use a chisel and a hammer to indent the axle nut in the proper spot. Now it's time to put the caliper back on after putting the brake pads back in first. Tighten the guide bolts down to 36 foot-pounds. And here we're just tidying up by putting the ABS sensor line bolts and nut back in. Here's the bottom bolt, tightening by hand first, and then just tightening the upper one by hand. And finally, the third one is a nut. The bracket itself attaches to the new upper control arm. It only goes on one way. And after that, I'm just going to tighten them all up with a wrench, using superhuman speed. Tighten the one at the top of the steering knuckle as well. Again, using superhuman speed where possible. And then tightening down the one at the bottom as well. And that about wraps it up. After that, you basically replace the tire, put your hands at the 12 and 6 o'clock locations, shake that tire to see if there's any play. In my case, it's completely solid, no more play or clicking going on. If you found this video helpful, let me know by hitting that like button. And don't forget to subscribe for notifications of our latest DIY projects as well as tool review videos. Thanks again for watching, and take care.